Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Two Friends Film Podcast. My name is Brian, and I'm back here with Fowler. Say hello.
Great to be here.
Perfect. And we are here to talk about Rashomon. It is a 1950s film by Kurosawa. It is a Japanese film set in the medieval sort of era in Japan. And just as like a trigger warning, the film does contain scenes regarded to sexual assault and rape. So if you're uncomfortable with any of those topics, I just want it to be known that we will be talking about some of that in the podcast here. So overall, I'm going to let Fowler take it away with the starting summary before we get into the really heavy analysis here. So take it away.
Yeah, Rashomon is really kind of a mystery thriller. And the breakdown for the summary is going to be a little bit more detailed than other episodes because it's kind of complicated, and there are kind of four stories throughout the film. But basically, there's a terrible crime that occurs in this forest where a husband and wife are traveling through the forest, and this bandit comes upon them, and he ties up the husband, he rapes the wife, and then what happens afterwards is ambiguous, but the wife runs away, the bandit runs away, and the husband ends up being killed by the wife's sort of protective dagger, which is inlaid with pearls and quite valuable. And so the story is kind of broken into kind of three sections that are mixed together. There's the flashbacks of the bandits telling his version of what happened, the wife telling her version of what happened, the dead husband telling his version of what happened, and kind of a random traveler that saw the crime happen telling what happened. And those sort of narratives are broken up by kind of sort of the whole story being summarized kind of in this broken down temple by that traveler character to other travelers. So in the bandit's version of the story, he attacks the couple, he captures the husband, rapes the wife, but in his version, both are fierce and strong and fight back. The wife attacks him with the knife and actually makes him bleed. And then the husband, the bandit frees the husband basically to give him an honorable chance. And the husband is like a highly skilled warrior, and they have a very close duel, which ends with the bandit killing the husband. And then kind of he flees. And in the wife's version, is very passive. She basically has like a mental breakdown after she's raped, and then when she kind of comes to, her husband is dead and she doesn't really know what's happened, and the bandit has kind of run away. In the husband's story, after the rape happens, the wife basically she's motivated by, and this will be kind of a thing we'll talk about this film, because the morality in the film, and morality is very important in this film, it's very medieval and it's not particularly modern, but the wife feels scarred by the fact that she's had intercourse with two men, and that's considered dishonorable, and so having one husband is sort of the more proper thing. So in order to kind of protect her reputation, she manipulates the bandit and the husband into fighting. And then when the bandit kills the husband, she promises whoever wins the duel she will marry, but she instead flees. And or maybe I think the bandit wins the fight and then the husband kills himself afterwards, kind of in a sense of dishonor. And then in the traveler's version of the story, it's kind of a hybrid of parts of all three, where the wife again is provoked into, she provokes the bandit and the husband into fighting by kind of challenging their manlyhood. But in his version, the fight is quite desperate and not at all skilled. And the husband dies begging for his life. The wife breaks her promise and runs away and doesn't marry anyone. And the bandit is also, in his story, kind of a weak character who is kind of easily manipulated by the wife and kind of doesn't have any conviction and offers to basically marry her and like abandon his lifestyle if the wife will marry him.
Yeah, and at the very end too, there's a plot with a child that the three travelers encounter after all the flashbacks as well.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I forgot that part.
yeah, and that's kind of like the only act of kindness throughout this entire cinematic experience. So I
The
guess
travelers, two of them decide that they're going to protect the child, and one of them decides that he's going to take the child and basically raise it as his own child.
yeah. So I guess with all that being said, it's a rather confusing film. It's definitely one worth watching to really get like understand it more than the brief summary we've given here. But I guess first we can talk about I guess first impressions, things that stuck out. So like for me in particular, what really stuck out was a lot of camera work. I know actually you mentioned this earlier, Fowler, but um, in the opening of it, you mentioned that a lot of the shots were static. And it's funny because later on in the film, like there's a lot of camera movement, a lot of different things. I think it's very interesting to see that your initial impression was well, like, is this typical of Kurosawa? Is this like something he does? But no, he actually incorporates a lot of movement. Um,
Yeah, Rashomon has an unbelievable amount of variety in like camera angles and kind of camera techniques, and it's almost like dizzying to watch it because it's so much more active and kind of eclectic than I feel like a lot of modern films.
I will say what's interesting too is like there were actually like for being a film that was like made in the early 50s, like you can see like different editing techniques and stuff like that. Like one that I took note of in particular was at the very end of the film with the two travelers, one being the monk and the other being the other traveler who eventually takes the child. Um, there's this like edit, like three different separate edits, which are fades into them just kind of standing there. But it's a very striking shot of them, the two of them standing there after hearing all this debauchery and these stories about these characters. Um, so
Yeah,
I
there's kind of this interesting variant of in a lot of the confession scenes and kind of the opening shots and ending shots. It's a lot of kind of like very Kubrick like big wide spaces and kind of holding on mainly people's faces and bodies while they monologue. But it's intermixed with a lot of kind of like fast moving camera work and a lot of like foliage and rain and like stone being in the way between different characters. It's a film that definitely like um, oscillates quite wildly between being very fast paced and being like very slow.
Yeah, and what I found to be in particular interesting as well is like they're like you actually pointed this out to me, which was that this film was actually the first Japanese film to use heavy flashbacks as well as uh, the narrative trope of an unreliable narrator. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what I was reading. It definitely is probably the spiritual influence of a lot of kind of unreliable narrator kind of mystery flashback films. Like obviously was The Usual Suspects feels very similar to this film.
Hmm.
I think it's Memento by Christopher Nolan. Like you can definitely tell that like this film is very much like the father of a very specific type of kind of mystery thriller.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to see too, like when we talked about Kubrick or Lucas was another guy who was very heavily influenced by Kurosawa, and specifically the Seven Samurai, which was not the film we watched today, but was one Kurosawa also did, influenced what went on to become Star Wars, right? And I think it's very interesting to like, because as an American audience, we don't really get these types of films anymore. I think in terms of like pacing, uh, it's a rather slow film, but I think it's a film that's slow and has something to say. Because I've seen slow films that don't really have a lot going on, but this film, uh, say what you want to will about it, but saying it doesn't have a lot going on would be a false statement on the film's behalf. You know?
I might disagree. It's slow by modern standards, but I think it did a really good job of kind of keeping the pace good. And mainly it did that by like kind of that like oscillation, the duality we were talking about, where
Yeah.
the flashbacks are really harrowing, kind of grisly stuff. There's a lot of like very dramatic, almost like theater like acting, like spittle, kind of like a lot of animalistic facial expressions. It's like incredibly grotesque and exaggerated, and I loved it. I thought it was really really powerful. And then those are kind of interlaced by um, kind of the B plot of the travelers talking, and one of the travelers telling the other two about kind of each of the four stories. And that's kind of the part where there's kind of more, that's where the themes kind of slip in, and the dialogue that is, I think, much more philosophical. I think it was a really good combination of kind of like emotion and action and philosophy. And I think there's a lot of modern directors, Christopher Nolan, who comes to mind, who like are not anywhere near as adept at like mixing those two together.
Mm. Yeah, and when I talk about the pacing, I would say like for a modern audience, that's what I'm talking about, right? Like, you know, films like this are not built for a modern audience, I think, because it takes some time to build that tension and everything. We get into the story pretty early, um, but I think it's one of those things that takes some time to build, and I think that's harder for uh, modern sort of audiences to appreciate. But I will
That
say,
makes sense.
um, on the note of, because we talked about a lot about themes and everything like that, and a lot of the themes relate to.
Well, before we get into themes, I just want to
Sure.
keep on the. I would say one of the weaknesses of the film. I didn't mind the pacing. I thought some of the stories were more kind of emotionally gripping than
Mm,
the others, and I think that was the main problem the film had. Of like the bandit story is just really powerful. Like he's just such a sadistic, vicious kind of bastard
yeah.
in that story, and it was very powerful. And I thought the um the husband story was also really powerful, with the wife kind of being this like incredibly
Hmm.
manipulative, like malevolent Machiavellian figure. But I thought the traveler story and the wife story were a little weaker. They didn't seem to have as much kind of dramatic power to them. And um because so much of like the stories rely on kind of these monologuing um kind of like stage pieces,
Hmm.
like it is I think hard to balance, because you really need the actor who sort of centers on each story to really carry it. And I think I think that was kind of uneven. I think there were stories that were much more powerful than others.
Well, I think the main thing, because actually that was what I wanted to talk about as well, is the dramatic element of it, right? Um, I think something that I was thinking about specifically with that sort of element is that it felt like you said, like a stage play, right? Almost like it could have been put on stage and felt very similar in terms of its atmosphere, right? Um, what I will say is like, do you think like some of the, because we talked about this a little bit, some of it is overacted a decent amount, I think. Um, do you think it detracts or adds to the atmosphere to have that like over the top performance? Because what struck me actually as a little bit odd is the husband's performance was a little more nuanced, a little more subtle, especially in
He felt like he was being directed by a different director.
yes, exactly. And so my question to you is like, do you like the sort of overacting element of it, or do you think it's like a little moss?
Well, I think I lean more. I like the heavier, more dramatic acting. I think naturally
Mm,
more than you do. But I would say I think it really fits the film really well because in each story, and we'll get into this when we talk about the themes.
mm,
Um, it's very much a distortion where each of the stories, the person telling the story is attempting to put themselves in the best light and kind of demonize everyone else. And I think because of that, because all the stories aren't actually true, and because all the stories are kind of deceptions,
mm,
like the over the top, almost cartoonish element of it, especially evil, the kind of how over the top and evil, kind of the antagonist of whichever story we're watching is. I thought that really worked because it's within the context of the film. Each story is not attempting to be nuanced or subtle in any way. They're attempting to paint a very propagandistic kind of view of the crime. And I think the crime itself being so grisly and shocking also kind of lends to that kind of over the top element. I would have liked the husband to kind of be a little bit more dramatic. I think it would have made his I think it would have made him pop a little bit more in
yeah,
some of the stories.
I could see that. I mean, for me, like you said, I've always preferred like a subtle sort of performance, but with this one in particular, it seemed like the dramatic sort of retelling of it works for the context of the film. Um, Something I was also thinking about was like just the overall like acting of not only the like three main sort of characters throughout these flashbacks, but the acting of the two other characters, like or the three other sort of travelers in the B plot,
Mm-hmm.
was nuanced as well. It felt like very subtle compared to the very dramatic performance of the bandit and the wife.
I would say I would largely agree the travelers are a little bit more toned down, but I think you can see those dramatic chops rear their head kind of near the end of the film because when the three travelers after the stories have concluded they find the baby in the temple.
Mm,
There's a confrontation between one of the travelers and that kind of wants to basically steal the the materials off the baby and leave it to die, and the one that essentially wants to save the baby. And I think that confrontation is also quite Shakespearean and dramatic.
yeah.
Kind of the monologuing and kind of the sadism and the kind of glee. It's a very it's very intense. I think all around.
So, is there something else you want to talk about before we go into some of our thoughts on the themes and everything like that?
I think the only thing besides that is the differences between the short story and the film.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, like I read through a good majority of it, uh, and when I read through it, it's basically word for word, sometimes even literally word for word. The short story is taken and put into the movie. It's pretty much. I didn't really get much. It's not like when we watched Arrival, where the the novella compared to the movie was actually a little bit different and a little like things were focused on differently. But for this, it seems like it was pretty, you know, eye for eye.
I think I largely agree. I think there's two differences though. One is um, the short story is just very dark. Like there is no light at the end of the tunnel,
Hmm.
whereas the film ends very powerfully with the two travelers deciding to save the child, and there is this element of kind of hope. While most of the film is very dark and very pessimistic, I think there's that hope element.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about this as the themes. I think while both are about human deception and how everyone lies and deceives others, I think I think the film argues that we do that for different reasons. In the short story, most of the murdering and raping and general kind of like thievery and all that stuff, it's largely driven by like desperation and poverty. It's kind of an economic thing where like things are just bad enough that everyone is, out for themselves. But and we'll talk about this more of the themes, but I think the film more argues that a lot of that lying and deception is really driven by society and social pressure.
Mm. It's interesting too,
Because
because
no one in the film it really has that like hunger or desperation that's in the short story. I mean, the husband and wife are obviously relatively well off. Um, I guess the traveler. I mean, he has an enormous family that he's supporting. I think it's like 6 kids or 5 kids,
at
and then
that
the
point
bandit
seven,
admits
with the
at
addition.
that point 7, and the bandit admits that he has been robbing for years and years, and he's actually stored away like an enormous amount of basically like booty, and that he actually can retire if he wants to. So it's yeah, I think it's we'll talk about whether that makes them more or less sympathetic, but I think it definitely changes like um, the reasons behind the story.
Yeah, I I feel as though and we can talk about. I guess we can go into the theme since that's kind of the direction we're going in anyway.
Mhm.
But I think really this film is about, like you said, deception and dishonesty, and how those things are how we as people try and present ourselves in the best light possible, you know. Um, and I guess this is the thing that stuck out to me as well. In each story, with each person telling it, they are the best, most honorable person in their own version of their story, right? Even with the addition
Totally.
of the traveler, and initially I was kind of like even after the fact I was like, do you think the traveler's telling the truth? And you don't think so. But I
I don't think so.
yeah, but I was like thinking in my head, okay, what does the traveler gain by like telling this story to them about all of the other people being dishonorable? And I guess like you pointed out to me, it's really this thing of like that is why he didn't come forward when confronted by the police there. Um,
Yeah, I think to summarize, like you were saying, the traveler frames everyone involved as being kind of weak-willed and dishonorable, and I think that's a justification because he refuses to come forward and testify, and the crime is basically never solved because he doesn't testify. So if one or more of those characters were honorable and decent, and still kind of that evil befell them, then I mean he is committing a great evil. He's participating in and perpetuating and allowing this kind of evil to go forward. But he frames them all as kind of being responsible in a fucked up way for what happened. And so I think that's and it's also it's implied that he stole the murder weapon, which also makes the investigation not happen because like he basically steals it to sell it, and so his story is very much one trying to um, frame himself as basically not having any moral culpability for the situation. And I think you can see that with a lot of them. I mean, the bandit in his narrative, he frees the husband and fights him honorably. The wife and the husband fight him and are vicious and are strong. Him
hmm,
killing the husband and also raping the wife, in kind of this medieval Japanese kind of setting, like he's framed as strong and honorable and decisive.
I
You know,
guess
he was brutal, but he was obeying sort of like masculine and sort of like societal norms for the way he should conduct himself.
I guess in a way the bandit showcases his story with almost every person in it being honorable, right? Like the wife tries to defend herself, doing the honorable thing. The He frees the husband to give him a fair fight, and the husband also fights honorably until his death, right?
And skillfully,
It's
he kind of claims the husband is like an excellent swordsman, and that like the his victory is not certain.
but it's interesting to me that the least moral character of the main sort of grouping would be the one who showcases everyone in the most honorable light.
I think we can talk about this more, but I think one of the things that ages Rashomon and makes it, I think, a harder thing to watch is Rashomon is a story about social conformity and and kind of about people being motivated by societal norms. And one of the problems with having a story about societal norms is that they change drastically. We look at the film and the bandit as this like raping, murdering monster. There is no framing in our moral context that like gives him a pass. And the wife, a lot of the tension in the story about her, about like her sexual assault making her no longer pure and no longer worthy. Um, I think that's also obviously also not really um, true within a kind of 21st century context, but makes sense within that medieval Japanese context. A lot of the tensions in Rashomon are very trapped in their era, and I think a lot of the ways that not just the bandit, I mean the wife, talking about her story, she frames herself as very passive and the victim. Like she's not responsible for anything. She's not influencing anything. Like everyone did everything else with her not participating. And like in our universe, that's kind of a crazy defense that doesn't make her look particularly good. But
Hmm.
like in that society, or her framing herself in that passive way is the only way in her mind to protect her reputation. I think the husband is very similar of like his framing of the wife tricking the bandit into killing or like defeating him and then not marrying him and running away, like kind of within that samurai context, like it allows him to be a tragic hero who is betrayed by his wife and then he kills himself and dies with honor. But it's kind of crazy now to watch it.
Yeah, obviously the social conventions are very different from our own 21st century sort of morality and senses of duty and what is right, right? But I think actually, let's take a moment. Is there other themes you want to talk about beyond this sort of this theme we've hit on a little bit here as well?
Besides deception,
Yeah, besides this, is there another one that sticks out to you, or
well, I think the other one is human nature, where like it's not like people are naturally deceptive.
mm,
Nobody in Rashomon is honest, and everyone is intrinsically motivated by their selfishness,
yeah,
whether it's sort of to preserve their own sense of self identity by lying to themselves about what they did and how honorable what they did is, or lying to others in order to maintain your position in society, to maintain your masculinity, to maintain your purity, to maintain your sort of like samurai code, I guess.
hmm. I guess yeah. I I didn't like that. Those seem like kind of the major themes to me. It seems like there's not a lot to talk about there. I guess, do you have any other final thoughts before we kind of start wrapping up here, or do you have any thoughts of other things you want to talk about as it relates to the film?
Well, I think there are other themes. Like we kind of mentioned this with the differences between the short story and the film. In Rashomon, I think you can make the argument that, like, in many ways, societal norms are what causes all the problems. You know, it is those societal pressures for the samurai to be honorable, for the bandit to be strong and masculine, for the wife to be pure, that like lends to not only the crime, but each of them lying and covering up the crime. Like it's the power dynamics in society and the roles that they've been forced to that causes them to be deceptive. Because obviously, no one fits cleanly into the social roles that society gives them, and so Rashomon kind of argues that you're kind of forced to um, contort yourself into those roles, or if you can't do that fully, then to deceive yourself and others by pretending that you fit into those roles. And I think that's a theme that you see visually too. I mean, um, the lying, whether it's between the travelers or with the four stories, they happen in a temple and in a court, respectively, places of purity. And yet, it is in these places that all of those lies are happening. And I think that's sort of a metaphor for society, that, it is kind of these societal ethics and societal norms and values that are like the kind of cage that has made all of these people behave in such monstrous ways.
And I think it's interesting to see all this like lying and deception, right, as your sort of main theme. But I think what, like we've talked about, really, uh, the thing at the end, the kindness, the ability to see a child struggling, to say, I will take responsibility, I will do the right and honorable thing here, and take care of this
Mm-hmm.
kid. Um, it's it's almost like Kurosawa was saying, this is human nature, but this is what we should strive to be as a society.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That he shows that it's not a fatalistic film in which, and I think this is something that's different about the short story, which I think is fatalistic.
Mhm.
Um, and I think another section of it where Kurosawa puts a level of agency into the film that isn't in the short story is um, kind of the most gripping part of the short story for me is the part where the bandit in that story, he finds this woman who's essentially stealing from corpses, and she justifies herself by saying that she's basically starving and that stealing these from these corpses is the only way that she can survive. And then he kind of turns it back on her and he says, like, if you steal to survive, then there's nothing to stop me from stealing from you to survive myself. And the film kind of takes that interaction and kind of expands on it, where it's kind of when the travelers are debating whether or not to save the child, the traveler who is just trying to steal from the baby, he makes the exact same argument that basically other people's evil justifies his evil. If the bandit and the wife and the husband and all these characters are going out and doing whatever they want, then there's no way to be honorable in a dishonorable world. But the film goes on after, when that traveler leaves, the true travelers do decide anyway to save the child. So it is kind of, I think it has a very different interpretation in the film than in the short story.
Yeah, I guess to wrap up here, I'll just give some of my final thoughts on the film. The
I have one more theme, and
sure,
then we can.
sure, yeah, go for it.
Oh, you say first because I'm going to change the subject a little bit.
Sure, sure. I was just gonna say, sort of the final thoughts I was having is that, I the first time I watched this, I was a student at my college, and we were watching this film as like a look at technique as well as like, the ability to tell a story without a reliable narrator, right? Or having a unreliable narrator as your main catalyst for a story. And I think looking at it now, while we talk about it and look at like different elements, it's interesting to pick up on, I guess, uh, how much that information has changed. Like how much from that time period I saw, like, okay, it's just a story about like debauchery, things like that, and really like at the end, like trying to twist that around. But I think for me,
Hmm.
personally, like, watching something then compared to now, it's so interesting to get those different little insights you get from, I guess, watching a film again, right? But go ahead
Hmm.
with the other thing you wanted to talk about before we wrap it up here for today.
Um, yeah, I had the opposite sort of situation I think than you did, where I read Octagawa's short story first, and then I watched the film, and it made me. I don't think when I read the short story initially, like I really realized how fatalistic it is. Like it wasn't until I saw the story retold with kind of Kurosawa adding this element of agency and choice and hope that I kind of realized like that was missing from the original short story when I read it.
Hmm.
So one of the things that I think is interesting, but um, perhaps is a bit of a stretch, is you could argue that there isn't any truth in the film because everyone is lying. But I think you could also interpret the film as kind of arguing that there is no such thing as a universal objective truth. That, everyone, even if they're not intentionally lying, are trapped within their own subjective ideas and what they will allow themselves to believe about themselves and the world and their actions.
Eh,
And I kind of wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
yeah, that's interesting. Well, I would actually, I think, tend to disagree because there are some elements in the story that are consistent throughout, right? Like the sexual assault in every story always takes place, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing there. There is always an element of the man dying because that is what happened. Now, what weapon he was murdered with is one of the things that's sort of a subjective between the stories, or how he ended up dying was also subjective between the stories. But I think there are kernels of like universal truth in these narratives that we find.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, that is also an interesting point. But I would say I tend to disagree just because I can see some of those truths throughout being at least somewhat more consistent.
That makes sense. There was an interesting thing I noticed, and I wonder if you interpreted it similarly. The weather is very interesting in this film, where um, in the present day, when the travelers are interacting with each other, and also the kind of beginning parts where everyone is entering the forest before the crime begins. There's like tree foliage blocking the sun. There's stone and rain blocking out these characters, and that's juxtaposed to when the stories are being told, which are we later learn are lies. Um, the sunlight is kind of raining down, and I interpreted that as like, you know, in reality, in the present, the truth is very uncertain. And really, the only time in which everything is fully clear when the sunlight is on those characters is in their subjective narratives, in their own self deceptions. And I think it's interesting how, at the end of the film, when the two travelers decide that they're going to save the baby, they use the same sunlight that kind of marks when people are lying on them. they're kind of shining it with light in the same way that that the liars were being shined on.
But I think the in this case it has the opposite effect, right? The ending of the rainstorm is the ending of the lies in the B plot, whereas the foliage, the sunny sort of environment, that's really what showcases the lying in your A plot, right? So it's kind of turning it on a head, I think. But
That's
yeah,
an interesting interpretation. I
yeah,
was thinking maybe because I'm interested in this idea of like there not being any truth.
hmm
You could argue if you view it as like kind of questioning truth itself rather than just the deception of humans. You could kind of argue that just like each of the stories was kind of a subjective narrative, you could argue that like saving the child and being motivated by selflessness and kindness is in itself kind of a deception and kind of a subjectiveness that they, that their sort of choices are also leading them down kind of a path in the same way that the lies were leading the bandit, the husband, and the wife down.
yeah. It's an interesting sort of perspective on it, for sure. Um, but that's about, I think, if do you have any closing thoughts, or is that where you'd like to end off here for today?
Maybe we rate it, then we can end off.
Sure, yeah. I know it's hard for me to like. It's a great film. I think. I think it's like way
Hmm.
up there in terms of the films I've seen. Um, I'd give it like because I usually do a point 0.5 running scale from like 1 to 10. So
Hmm.
I'd put it at a like 9.5.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I'd put it way high up there for sure.
Do you think? Do you think that the kind of films that use this style and these kind of techniques later, like Usual Suspects or like Memento,
Mm,
uh, do you think there are ways that they've improved on Kurosawa's format to make it kind of a more powerful story?
are you asking like are those films more powerful than his work, or are you asking like is because what exactly are you asking there?
Well, I'm just curious if you think that those kind of later stories that were inspired by this, like the alterations they've made, whether you think it makes them stronger films and whether you think in any way it improves on this kind of model.
It's interesting because I think I don't know if it necessarily improves upon it. I think it takes it in a different direction, right? Like
Hmm.
when I think of like a film like Rashomon, I think that you can see the influences of other film, whether it relates to cinematography, narrative perspective. It you can see the influences in other work, but I think what that work does is it takes that like those little elements it wants to take from it and then branches off in its own direction. So you can see kind of the kernels of what was working previously brought into a more modern sense.
That makes sense.
But yeah,
I think
what
it's interesting. A lot of the more popular ones after Rashomon did not end ambiguously. I think that's one of the things about it that's really unique. Is it's the one part that really wasn't, really taken and used by other generations. Is that Kurosawa really ends the story without really giving a conclusive answer about anything. There's no real way of knowing who is right and who is not.
yeah. Also, like, I guess since we're gonna end off here soon, where would you rank it? Like, where would you put it in your catalog of films you've seen up to this point?
Well, I think it's hard to rank just because I don't really know the context. Like we were talking earlier about how it was really an innovator in a lot of ways, but
Mm,
I think um, I think it's aged fairly well. I think talking about social norms is always something that will like age your story. But I think kind of on a technical level, we were talking last podcast about like like how ambitious a film is versus whether it succeeds. And I think Rashomon really was like the perfect balance of like really good camera work, really good editing, really good acting, really interesting themes, and then like really landing on all of those things. I think it was a very even film. I can't think of any element that was really like subpar.
Yeah. I'm just glad for the first time during our random picking of our films that it landed on a film I recommended. I thought it was going to be a consistent, like, going down the list of you constantly getting the films you've suggested in our list. Um,
If only.
oh, it would have been great. But yeah, on that note, it was that's going to be it for us today. Thank you guys so much for listening. Stay tuned for some more podcasts in the future, and we'll talk to you very soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Goodbye.